By the time a fracture occurs, decades of preventable bone loss have already happened. Osteoporosis is described as a silent disease, but the science reveals it is a process with a predictable timeline and multiple intervention points that most people never act on. Peak bone mass is established by age 30. After 50, women can lose up to 3 to 5% of bone density per year in the first decade post-menopause. Men lose bone mass more slowly but are not exempt. Cummings and Melton's Lancet Epidemiology showed that 1 in 2 women and 1 in 5 men over 50 will suffer an osteoporotic fracture in their lifetime. Cummings and Melton's 2002 Lancet review established osteoporosis as a global public health crisis, with hip fractures alone carrying a 1-year mortality rate of 20% in elderly patients. Yet bone density loss is not an inevitable consequence of aging. It is the measurable result of inadequate calcium, vitamin D, protein, and mechanical loading accumulating over decades. This video is grounded in 5 peer-reviewed studies from Journal of Clinical Investigation, Lancet, Osteoporosis International, Medicine and Science in Sports and Exercise, and Calcified Tissue International, covering osteoporosis pathophysiology, fracture epidemiology, and the evidence for prevention and reversal. The conventional approach to bone health treats it as a postmenopausal woman's issue, addressed with calcium supplements and a DEXA scan after 65. The research reveals this framing misses the critical prevention window. Bone mass peaks at age 25 to 30, and building maximum peak bone mass during youth determines fracture risk decades later. Reyes Journal of Clinical Investigation Review documented that bone is a dynamic tissue with continuous remodeling controlled by osteoblasts and osteoclasts, a balance that can be shifted favorably at any age. The consequences of a hip fracture in individuals over 65 are far more serious than the injury itself. Cummings and Melton's Lancet data showed a 20% 1-year mortality rate following hip fracture, driven by complications including pneumonia, blood clots, and deconditioning from immobility. 40% of hip fracture survivors require long-term care. This is not a cosmetic or quality of life issue. It is a life-threatening condition that is largely preventable. Bone density loss is silent until fracture, but risk factors are identifiable and modifiable decades in advance. Reyes Pathogenesis Review identified the key biological drivers: estrogen and testosterone decline, accelerating osteoclast activity, inadequate calcium and vitamin D reducing mineralization, insufficient mechanical loading removing osteoblast stimulation, and excess cortisol from chronic stress directly inhibiting bone formation. Weaver et al.'s 2016 Osteoporosis International Meta-Analysis of 33 randomized controlled trials covering over 51,000 participants remains the definitive evidence base for calcium and vitamin D supplementation and fracture risk. The combination intervention reduced hip fracture risk by 16% and total fracture risk by 13%, effects that were largest in institutionalized elderly individuals and those with baseline vitamin D deficiency. Resistance training is the most potent mechanical stimulus for bone formation available. Court et al. SACSM position stands synthesized evidence showing that bone responds to mechanical loading through piezoelectric signaling that activates osteoblasts. The threshold load required to stimulate bone formation exceeds normal daily activity, meaning walking alone is insufficient, while impact loading and resistance training produce significant osteogenic response. Multiple interventions contribute to bone density maintenance and improvement. The evidence base for each has been quantified in randomized controlled trials, allowing a clear comparison of their osteogenic impact. Bone remodeling is a continuous process controlled by the balance between osteoblasts, bone-building cells, and osteoclasts, bone-resorbing cells. Understanding this cycle reveals the precise targets for intervention and why multiple simultaneous inputs, mechanical, nutritional, and hormonal, are required. The evidence-based bone preservation framework addresses all 4 controllable variables simultaneously: mechanical loading, calcium and vitamin D, protein adequacy, and hormonal status. Addressing any single variable in isolation produces suboptimal results. The interventions are synergistic. The timeline for bone density response to intervention follows the natural bone remodeling cycle, which takes approximately 3 to 6 months for a complete cycle. Meaningful changes in DEXA scan measurements require consistent intervention over 12 to 24 months. The daily implementation of a bone preservation protocol is straightforward. These 6 actions collectively provide the mechanical, nutritional, and hormonal inputs required for net bone formation. Bone health protocol must be personalized based on baseline DEXA results, hormonal status, and fracture risk profile. These adjustments ensure intervention intensity matches clinical need. Bone density loss is not inevitable, It is the predictable result of decades of modifiable deficits. Here is what the science shows about preventing and reversing it. The evidence is clear. The mechanism is understood. And the steps to protect your bones are within reach for anyone who starts before the fracture occurs. Follow MedBrief Today for more science-backed health insights, explained clearly.